Hello. Today we're going to be talking about economics again. We're going to be looking at some of the issues within economics as they relate to creating a more sustainable society. And we'll be asking the question about how and in what way do we need to reform economics if we're to achieve a more sustainable society. I would like to make the point that we all need to have a basic understanding of economics. It's too important not to engage with. Thinking about environmental protection, sustainability without understanding economics is like trying to build greenhouses and thinking about it only once the house is built, when you can worry then just about like what kind of light bulbs you're going to put in. You need to think about things in a holistic way. And the only way you can think about sustainability in a holistic way is to integrate economics into your thought process. Or maybe we can flip that around and say that we need economics to think more holistic, and that we will only achieve a more sustainable society when we start to have a more inclusive economic way of thinking that aims for achieving sustainability. So what are some of the current flaws with the current state of economics? One could argue that, especially given the model we use in our country, it pushes important areas to the margins, things like leisure, things like problems of poverty, homelessness, pollution. These are things that get very little attention from mainstream economic doctrines, schools of thought on what should be the primary preoccupations of macroeconomics. Um, we'll look at that in a little more detail now. So, part of the problem with economics is a problem exists with all academic disciplines. Things are siloed. Um, John Maynard Keynes, even 90 years ago, talked about problem with economics being too siloed and said to develop a better economics field discipline of economics, economists had to be broadly trained, starting with a good knowledge of history, but expanding beyond that. As we'll see in our next lecture, Keynes was very critical of economists who he felt just understood economic theory and were good with math, but really had very little concept of incorporating what else was going on in the world into their economic theories. Um, Keynes was also very critical of the idea of economics as a physical science. As we'll see again during the next lecture, many people today would agree with Keynes that economics should be built more as a moral discipline. And if you considered it more of a moral discipline, this would open the space for values of sustainability to be incorporated into economic prescriptions. I'll go over a few problems with economics. These are some of the things that you often hear people criticize economics about. Um, we'll go through these in a little bit of detail, beginning with the ergodic axiom. This is the foundation of the efficient market hypothesis, and it's the idea that data samples from the past are equivalent to data samples from the future. And this kind of sounds ridiculous. If you really do, you really believe that the past is going to repeat itself in the future? But if you believe that economics is a hard science like chemistry or physics, you're kind of stuck in that you have to believe in the ergodic axiom. The ergodic axiom is at the foundation of a lot of modeling. And if you consider the film that you've watched, The Inside Job, that looks at some of the economic meltdowns that took place on Wall Street, because of the use of the ergodic axiom. For example, there were Goldman Sachs models that predicted what happened on one day was rarer than a once in a million year event, and then that actually happened 3 or 4 days in a row. So it tells you that something is wrong with the models, and the models is how the data is being treated. Okay, I mentioned that this problem also with the goals. Problem with the goals is that they're very limited. So if you were to, depends on the textbook you pick up these days. This came from a 10-year-old textbook I picked up. It's actually a little older than that. It was printed in 2008. This is what was being used at the time in a macro class at UNC. And in the early part of the textbook, it listed the goals of macroeconomics as being economic growth, low unemployment, low inflation, sustainable trade deficits. Clearly, there's a lot of things missing from these goals. What about environmental sustainability? What about maintaining a certain degree of income equity? Many macroeconomists would argue that these are laudable goals, but they don't fit within the bounds of their discipline. And this is where the whole idea of silos is problematic, where we have to start to get away from silos and bust that up. If you're the engineer of a house, how can you say that your concern is not one of efficiency, that you're, or the architect, that your job is simply to make a nice looking house? You've got to think more systemically. We've got to push macroeconomics to broaden its goals. Today, in some tier one universities, macroeconomics is taught with a somewhat broader perspective, but probably in most business schools, this is what the focus is, the kind of how it's defined, how it's shaped. And again, we have to think about how to break down this silo and broaden what the goals are. Another problem relevant to this course is that economics pushes too much short-term optimization rather than long-term resiliency. Seeing a lot of this, how this can be a problem when it comes to the food supply. Production policies that lead to short-term optimization in food production can undermine the ability of low-income countries to adapt to rapid price hikes and keep food staples. Even during COVID-19, we've seen that policies aimed at optimization in the food supply chain, particularly when it comes to meat, how they have undermined the resiliency of the food supply chain, how farmers have been slaughtering, euthanizing millions of animals because of problems with the meat processing facilities. We've allowed in the United States for a few companies to dominate this industry. And when one major production facility has to close, then that gums up the entire supply chain and farmers are left having to kill off animals rather than putting them in the supply chain. So this is a good example of how short-term optimization thinking actually can sometimes blow up in our face. For a long time, economists were on board with policies that favored the continued use of fossil fuels. That's starting to shrink because renewables are becoming so cheap. But even before renewables had become on a par or cheaper than fossil fuels, you would think economists would have been arguing against ignoring the long-term consequences of climate change, of pushing to price that into the cost of fossil fuels. But rarely have you heard at least macroeconomists make that point. Most people who get to the level of having the ear of policy leaders have not pushed that. This is an issue now, the idea that neoclassical economic theory relegates national interest. It's been quite prevalent in the Trump administration, the idea of how free trade has, over time, in recent years, worked against the US interest, and seen a lot of erosion of US economic power and blaming of our emphasis on policies to grow the global economy versus maintaining a robust US economy. Um, from an environmental protection, there's been a point of view, there's been some problems too with push on globalization that's entirely economic and trade focused. Um, global agreements that simply focus on trade and ignore the environment create the potential for what's known as a race to the bottom, where some countries will deliberately keep environmental protection weak in order to attract certain industries. And this can be a concern when it comes to regulating the environment anywhere. The idea that if you protect your environment too much, you might be encouraging industry to pick up and move and go elsewhere. If you build that into agreements, though, where you pay a tariff, if you're a dirty good, then that can mitigate this problem. This is, we'll be talking in the next lecture more about the key tenets of classical economics, and what you find when you look at key tenets, things like the efficient market hypothesis and the rational actor model, is that few people actually believe in this anymore, but people who don't believe in this continue to teach it as though it was reality. Again, this may not be true in a school like UNC or Harvard. Actually, in Harvard, students had to fight. They fought really hard for the textbook to be changed about 10 years ago because their textbooks were teaching them fantasies. But in many schools, and especially in business schools, the fantasy is still what students are learning. Okay, this isn't particularly a problem of economists per se, because GDP, gross domestic product, is a good tool, but it can be misused by society. First of all, we tend to use it as a kind of report card for our government at the time. If GDP is doing well, then that tends to bestow legitimacy on the government. Good chances, if it's a democracy, that that government will be reelected. But GDP is in itself an imperfect tool. We need other tools to kind of measure how society is doing. Just because GDP is growing doesn't mean that everything is getting better in society. For example, most of the economic gains of that economic growth could be going to a small, narrow elite, which has to some degree been the case in the United States recently. Some services and products included in GDP can also actually lower our well-being. Expenditures on pollution, cleanup, military, police security, services for drug addiction and lawsuits, all on face of it increase GDP, because these are part of goods and services, but they don't necessarily make our lives better. GDP doesn't take into account negative effects on the environment, depletion of natural capital like forests, or other externalities. Free time or leisure is also not included in GDP analysis. And finally, unpaid tasks like child rearing are undervalued, and domestic labor is also not valued. So the work of parents who stay home and raise children is ignored in GDP. And again, I'm not saying we need to change the tool or the measurement. In order to get a better idea of how society is doing, we need to understand that we need multiple measurement tools. So we'll be talking a little bit more about neoclassical economists in the next lecture, but this is kind of the way, if you listen to them and their prescriptions, they tend to see society as something that's subsumed by the economy. As a matter of fact, Margaret Thatcher, and a famous adherent of neoliberalism, which is an offshoot of neoclassical economics, actually said there's no such thing as society. They're only individuals and their family basically operating under this umbrella of the economy. The last part I added, she did say the part about there being no such thing as society, just individuals and their families. The environment then is something that exists outside of this, something that you exploit and you bring in to the economy. You use the environment as a natural resource piggy bank to grow the economy. I want to present now some different versions of sustainability. This is more of a deep ecology version where human society is nested within the environment and economy then is nested within human society. This is probably not the most practical version. So for the rest of the semester, we're going to be using this second way of depicting sustainability. And we're going to talk about the importance of balancing the social, the environment, and the economic part of the equation. That if you just focus on one, you create imbalance. If you focus just on trying to make the environment, for example, more sustainable, and you don't consider its impact on the economy, or if you're pushing for policies that are going to exacerbate inequality and hurt low-income people the hardest, you're probably not going to be very successful. And if you succeed once, you're going to develop powerful coalitions against you. So this sweet spot is really what is here in the middle. And final version, kind of an image of what the economy can be. It's becoming popular now in the United States. It's been popular in Europe for quite some time now. It's the idea of developing a circular economy, one in which instead of waste pollution, things that are landfilled, etc., we create an economy where things are circular, where we reuse things and we don't produce waste. So this is another version for looking at the economy. I want you to think, and we're going to talk about this, I want you to give some examples of things you care about that have to do with the environment, and think about how you could promote policies that get us in this sweet spot. I want you to be prepared to talk about this in class tomorrow. We'll go over a few examples and think about how this approach is the best approach. And this is the approach, the lens that we'll be using to look at sustainability for the rest of the semester. Thank you very much for listening.